In the spring of 2019, a man from the county extension office stood in Nora Brandt's barnyard in Barton County, Kansas, looked at the open-pollinated grain sorghum seed she had laid out on a clean tarp in cloth bags tied with cotton twine, and told her that what she had inherited was a museum collection, not a seed program. His name was Dale Foss. He had a master's degree in agronomy from Kansas State. He was not a bad man. He believed every word he said. 3 years later, in October of 2022, a senior seed buyer from a heritage grain cooperative in Wichita sat at Nora's kitchen table, held a cloth bag labeled Brandt's Early Red in her left hand, set it down without a word, and offered $4.40 a pound for certified foundation seed 2000. 200 pounds if Nora could certify the lot. That was a number Dale Foss had told her the old seed could never command. A museum collection, he had said, had no commercial value in a hybrid market. Nora did not answer right away. She set her coffee cup on the oilcloth and looked at her grandfather's field journal, open on the table between them. Buck, her border collie, lifted his gray muzzle from the floor, then put it back down. Between the dismissal and that offer was a drought that broke half the county, a neighbor's combine payment that kept coming due on a harvest that didn't, and a mechanism that Nora's grandfather had spent 56 years breeding into the ground without ever explaining it to anyone but her, and the story of how those things connected is the one worth telling. Otto Brandt came to that 320 acres in Barton County in 1961 when he was 27 years old, and the ground cost him $11 an acre. He had $80 in savings and a coffee can of grain sorghum seed his mother had kept through 2 dry years in the 1952 when the ground in the southwestern corner of Kansas had dried back toward what it had been. Adjusting anything, Otto's mother had grown up in that decade. She had kept seed through it, the same way women in that county kept seed through bad years, which was by refusing to eat it. She gave the can to Otto when he left for Barton County with the understanding, never stated as such, that he was expected to keep what she had kept. He put 80 of his 320 acres into sorghum that first season, and the rest into winter wheat, which was the crop the county ran on. The sorghum yielded 37 bushels per acre, which was below the county average. He made a note of it and said nothing to anyone. In 1962, he planted the same sorghum on the same 80 acres, and also planted 4 additional rows at the edge of the field. From seed, he had specifically pulled off the strongest standing plants in 1961, the ones that had held their grain heads up through a 3-week dry patch in July, when the rest had stalled and waited. In 1962, the new rows yielded 43 bushels per acre. The rest yielded 38. He made a note of it. What Otto did, starting that first season and continuing without interruption for 56 years, was simple in description and demanding in practice. When he harvested his sorghum each fall, he walked the field before the combine touched it, and he pulled seed heads by hand from the plants that had set grain well even where the soil had cracked and the August heat had leaned hard on the rows. He dried those heads in the cellar, threshed them by hand into cloth bags he labeled in pencil, and added them to the cedar chest. He kept notes in a green canvas-covered field journal, recording rainfall by month, high temperatures by week, and the yield from each distinct row or patch of ground. He noted soil texture where he knew it changed, which on 320 acres of variable Kansas ground meant noting it often. He noted which years had gone dry in May, and which in August, and which had been wet through to the end, and what the difference in his selective rows had been in each case. The journal ran to 9 volumes between 1961 and 2017, the year he died at 83 on a Wednesday morning in September, quietly, in the same bedroom he had slept in since 1961. Nora had grown up on that farm. She had spent summers helping with the field walking before the harvest, though she had not known at the time that what she was helping with was a half-century selection program. It had seemed to her like her grandfather's particular variety of stubbornness, a refusal to let the combine do the whole job, an insistence on walking the rows himself while the neighbors drove straight through. She had not thought to ask why, until she was old enough that asking seemed unnecessary, and then she had gone to Kansas State in 2009 for an environmental science degree, which she finished in 2013, and then spent 5 years doing watershed work for a nonprofit. She left that work with mixed feelings and no regrets when the phone call came from Barton County in October of 2018, and drove back out on a Tuesday, let herself into the house with the key still under the same flat stone, and found Buck asleep in the kitchen, already 11 years old, one ear permanently cocked sideways from a long-heeled wire cut, waiting for someone to come home. The cedar chest was in the cellar, padlocked, and the journal was on the kitchen table with a note in Otto's handwriting that said, "All the instructions are in the book." She spent 3 evenings reading Volume 9 before she opened the chest, 47 varieties, each in a cloth bag. Some labeled in hands she recognized as her grandfather's, a few in an older script she didn't, and understood later had been her great-grandmother's. The original coffee can of seed having been the start of something Otto simply kept going. She sat on the cellar steps with a flashlight and held the bags one at a time, reading the labels. The bags were not neatly uniform. Some were burlap, some cotton muslin, some cut from feed sack material in a print that had been fashionable sometime in the 1942. The labels were in pencil, most in Otto's hand, a few in a hand that was older and tighter, and all of them named. She was not sentimental about it, or tried not to be. She had an environmental science degree, and she understood, at least in theory, what open-pollinated seed selection could mean over decades. She knew about genetic diversity and population genetics, and the concept of landraces, which are crop varieties that develop through informal selection over many generations in a specific environment. But she had not done the math yet, and she had not read the drought years in the journal yet, and she did not fully know what she had. Dale Foss came in April of 2019, 4 months after Nora had planted her first crop on Otto's ground. He came because she had called the extension office, asking about county yield data to benchmark against, and he showed up 2 days later in a white Kansas State Extension pickup with his name on the door panel, wearing pressed khakis and a Navy logo jacket. He was 52 years old. Glasses, patient manner, a slide folder under one arm. He genuinely thought he was there to help. He looked at the cloth bags. He looked at Nora's planting records. He looked at the seed packets she had ordered from her grandfather's personal stock. "Nora," he said, and he set the folder down on the tarp and rested one hand on the edge of it. "What you've got here is a museum collection, not a seed program." He explained it carefully. The Pioneer 84G62 hybrid sorghum he was recommending averaged 78 bushels per acre in county trials under normal conditions. It had certified germination rates. It had uniform maturity, which mattered for combine efficiency. The old open-pollinated varieties hadn't been in a replicated trial in decades. Yield drag of 10 to 15% was typical when farmers who had tried them compared to hybrid performance. He was not dismissing Otto's work, he said. He was describing the market reality. Nora thanked him for coming. She said she was going to plant the old seed anyway. He nodded, as though he had expected this sentiment was a real force in agriculture. He understood that. He asked if she had considered planting at least a portion of her acreage in a certified hybrid program as a side-by-side comparison, so she could see the yield gap for herself and make a data-informed decision. Nora said she had considered it. She said she would rather run the whole 240 sorghum acres in the old varieties one season and see what she had before splitting the ground. Foss drove away and Nora planted. Nora was known in the county to the extent that a woman who had been gone 9 years and come back quiet was known at all, for two things: her memory and her patience. Her memory, which her grandfather's neighbors said was as good as Otto's had been, and her tendency to watch the ground for a long time before she said anything about what she saw. She had planted her sorghum by the 3rd week of May, 2 weeks after the county average, because Otto's journal noted that his early planted ground always showed higher aphid pressure and late planting reduced that. And she walked her rows every morning for the first 6 weeks of the season at 5:30 before the heat came. She was not alone that summer in a county sense, meaning there were other farmers within a mile in every direction doing essentially the same thing on their ground with different seed. Marcus Webb, who farmed the 400 acres adjacent to the Brandt place on the north and east sides, planted pioneer hybrid sorghum on his level ground and grain corn on the bottom acres, the same program he had run for 8 years, with consistent results. Marcus was 41 that year, the son of a man Nora's father had grown up with, and he treated Nora with the particular warmth that Barton County neighbors extend to people whose families they have known long enough to remember them in a different form. He had come over in November of 2018 to check on the place when he heard she was back and brought a frozen casserole from his wife, Linda, and he had looked at the seed chest in the cellar without saying anything negative, which Nora took as a form of support. He was running a certified hybrid program because the certified hybrid program worked. His yields in 2018 had been 79 bushels per acre on his sorghum ground. He had a reputation in the county for clean fields and good record-keeping, which were adjacent virtues in a place where both reflected the same underlying discipline. He had been approached by a pioneer field rep in the winter of 2018 about participating in a county seed performance trial, which he had agreed to do, and the participation included access to the latest hybrid variety data. When Nora's 2019 harvest came in at 68 bushels per acre on the sorghum ground, the county average for certified hybrid sorghum was 78. She wrote 68 in her own journal, without comment. She had expected to be behind. What she had not expected, which she noted to herself and no one else, was that her worst field, the ridge ground where the subsoil ran thin, had still come in at 61 bushels, where the neighbors on similar ridge ground running Pioneer Hybrid had averaged. She filed that number and went back to the journal. Marcus called her in November of 2019 to catch up. He had farmed the 400 acres next to the Brandt place since before Nora was born, and he had been her father's closest friend. He was in good spirits. He had just financed the new John Deere S780 combine, $312,000, financed over 8 years, at a payment of $31,000 a year, because his 2019 yields had been strong enough to justify it, and his banker had agreed. The hybrid program was working. He was going to put in a new grain bin, too, come spring. He mentioned that the Pioneer trial rep had told him the new 84 G62 variant they were planning for 2020 showed an additional 4 bushels per acre over the previous year's hybrid in county conditions modeling. She meant it. Marcus was a good farmer, and she was glad he'd had a good year. If you've ever watched two paths run parallel and known that they can't stay that way forever, if you've ever sat at a fence line and looked at a difference you couldn't yet explain, then you know something of what Nora was watching in those early years. She'd be grateful to hear your thoughts on that in the comments because the people who've lived it tend to recognize it in a way that is hard to put into words. Back in Kansas, the watching continued. The 2020 season was normal. Normal for Barton County means dry in May, wet in June, hot in July, variable in August. Nora's sorghum yielded 71 bushels per acre. The county hybrid average was 81. She was still 10 bushels behind, same as the year before, and if you had run that gap through a spreadsheet in 2020, you would have concluded, as Dale Foss concluded in a brief follow-up call that October, that the old varieties were simply underperforming and sentiment was a poor substitute for certified yield data. Foss was not wrong by any standard he had available to him. In 2020, in a normal year, the gap was real and consistent and pointed clearly in one direction. Let me tell you about root depth, because this is where the story turns, and it is not magic, and it is not sentiment. It is biology, and it is time. And once you understand it, what happened in the summer of 2022 is not surprising at all. It is arithmetic. A grain sorghum plant feeds itself from the soil through two kinds of roots. The crown roots anchor the plant and handle most of the wet year feeding when water is near the surface. The deep nodal roots are the emergency system, the ones that reach down into subsoil when the top foot of ground has gone dry. In a normal crop year, deep nodal roots are almost irrelevant. There is enough water in the top 2 feet of soil. In a drought year, they are the only thing that matters. Modern certified hybrid sorghum is bred primarily under conditions of adequate moisture and high fertility input. The breeding programs run 3 to 5 years of replicated trials. What those trials measure is peak yield performance, meaning how much grain the plant sets when it has what it needs. What they cannot measure in 3 to 5 seasons is how a plant's root architecture responds to a decade of drought stress cycling through the specific subsoil of a specific piece of ground. That kind of information takes longer to accumulate than a commercial breeding program's timeline allows. Otto Brandt's seed selection program ran for 56 years. Each fall, in the bad years, as in the good years, he pulled seed heads from the plants that had held up. In the dry years, 1974, 1980, 1988, 1996, 2011, he pulled seed heads specifically from the rows that had set grain while others failed. And he noted in his journal which field position those rows came from, whether they sat over the draw where the subsoil ran wetter. He selected, without naming it as such, for the root architecture that could reach where the water was when the water was not where it was supposed to be. There is a term for what his plants had developed, though Otto never used it in his journal. It is called osmotic adjustment. When the soil dries out, a plant that can draw water from dry ground does so by concentrating solutes, sugars, potassium ions, certain amino acids, in the cells of its root tips, which lowers what plant physiologists call the water potential gradient inside the root. The steeper that gradient, the more water the root can pull from soil that would otherwise be too dry to give anything up. It is the plant's way of reaching for water by making itself thirstier than the ground is dry. Breeding for that trait is not something you do in a greenhouse trial with plastic pots. It happens across drought cycles in a real field with real subsoil variation, and it takes generations. Otto ran 3 generations of sorghum in some of his selection years. His seed carried 56 years of that selection. His Brandt's early red variety had root systems that Nora would later learn averaged 6 to 7 feet in dry conditions, against the 4-foot norm for the hybrids growing across the fence. Nora did not know any of this clearly when she planted her first crop. That she suspected it, in the way you suspect something when you have read enough field notes in a dead man's handwriting to understand he was paying close attention to something specific. But she had not yet converted the suspicion into certainty, and certainty would take more seasons than she had so far spent on the ground. Marcus hit 81 bushels per acre on his sorghum that year, and bought the grain bin in the spring of 2021. It was a 30,000 bushel corrugated steel bin, the kind that takes 2 weeks to build and costs close to $40,000, and it sat on the north end of his place, visible from the road like a landmark. He also put in a new center pivot irrigation system on the South 80, financed separately, at a payment Nora didn't know the exact figure on, and she saw the pivot for the first time when she drove by in April, and it was already turning, catching the low morning light on its aluminum truss. She sat in her truck and watched it for a moment. The Ogallala Aquifer lay under most of that part of Kansas, which was why irrigation was possible at all, and the water table in parts of Barton County had been declining for 20 years, at a rate that varied by well and by depth, but trended in one direction across the county average. That was a lot of fixed cost per acre, going in on the assumption that water would keep coming in sufficient quantity and that the yield premiums that justified the financing would keep coming as well. She made a note of that too, though she kept it to herself. Marcus was not foolish. He was betting on what the data said, which was reasonable, and the data in 2021 did not yet say what it would say in 2022. The spring of 2021 brought Dale Foss to the county extension meeting at the Barton County Fairgrounds in March. Nora sat in the third row in her barn coat and listened to his yield data summary for the county, which showed hybrid sorghum performing well across the region, with the Pioneer 84 G62 averaging 83 bushels per acre on enrolled trial farms and 81 county-wide. The summary included a column for alternative seed programs that showed persistently lower average yields over 3 growing seasons of documented comparison. The column did not name anyone. It did not need to. He addressed the room when the question period opened, and he looked in her direction, not unkindly when he said, "I respect what her grandfather built over many years, but a museum collection doesn't compete with certified hybrid performance data. The gap isn't opinion, it's the numbers." There was a scattering of nods around the room. A few people glanced at Nora. She looked at the table in front of her, a man she did not know. 2 rows ahead and to her left leaned over to his neighbor and said something she could not hear clearly. The neighbor nodded. She drove home and sat in Otto's kitchen with volume 7 of the Journal open to 1988, the year of the last serious drought to grip Barton County before the one coming. The county had not had a drought of that magnitude in 34 years. The memory of it had faded, as agricultural memories tend to the shape of a number and a year, rather than the particular texture of what it had felt like to watch uniform fields flag and stall and give up. The yield data remained, in the county extension records and in Otto's journal both, but data does not carry the physical fact of a drought through time the way a person who walked those fields can carry it. And there were not many people left in Barton County in 2021 who had walked fields in 1988 and understood in their bodies what that summer had meant. That was the year Otto had written in his careful, plain-spoken hand that the early red had held to 62 on the ridge ground where the weeds lost their stand entirely. Not an astonishing number. but a number that meant something when the county average that year had been 38. Nora ran the arithmetic on the back of a notebook page. The early red had yielded 163% of the county average in the worst drought year Barton County had seen since the 1,950 A 10-bushel yield gap in a normal year would not recover the cost of that gap if it disappeared entirely in the year that mattered most. She read that entry twice. Then she read around it, looking at the planting notes from the 5 winters before that drought year, looking at which selection decisions had fed into which seed bags, trying to trace backward from the 62 to the decisions that had produced it. She found, in the winter selections of 1983 and 1986 especially, notes that Otto had been particularly careful to pull seed from plants in the draw ground and the upper ridge both, specifically to maintain what he called range, which was his word for genetic breadth across the subsoil variation of his particular 320 acres. She found a note from 1974, another dry year, in which he had written that he pulled seed from the North Ridge rows that year, because those were the survivors, and that the South Draw had held better overall, but the North Ridge survivors were the ones worth keeping. She did not yet have the technical vocabulary to name what her grandfather had been doing. She had enough vocabulary to understand what it had produced. She stayed at the table until after midnight. Buck slept at her feet and snored quietly, his gray muzzle resting on the toe of her left boot. Over the winter of 2021 into 2022, she reread all 9 volumes of the journal with a different eye. She was no longer reading for the yield numbers alone. She was reading for the drought years, for the selection notes that preceded and followed them, for the pattern of what her grandfather had saved and why. She found 4 drought years documented in careful detail, beginning with 1956 in her great-grandmother's hand in the coffee can's original records, which Otto had transcribed into Volume 1 in 1962 from memory and from the scrap of paper his mother had kept, 1974, 1980, and 1988 in Otto's own hand. In each case, the selection notes in the preceding 5 years showed a pattern of pulling seed from the plants that had performed under stress rather than the plants that had performed under adequate moisture. The pattern was not accidental, and it had not been unconscious. It was what Otto had set out to do from the beginning, because his mother had told him that a seed worth keeping was a seed that held up when the holding up was hard. Spring 2022 was dry. Not alarmingly so in March and April, but dry enough that the soil profiles going into May were already running 20% below normal on moisture in the top 3 feet. Nora noticed the county soil reports and thought about root depth, and then she planted and did not say anything to anyone about what she was thinking. Dale Foss came for a kitchen table visit in late April of 2022. Nora had invited him herself, in a spirit she later described to no one, because there was no one to describe it to, as wanting a fair hearing one more time. She put coffee on and laid out her yield records for 2019-2020, and the 2021 season. She had just finished at 72 bushels per acre, still behind the county hybrid average of 84. Foss looked at the records. He was not dismissive. He was thorough. He spent 20 minutes with her numbers and asked clarifying questions about her fertility program. Then he put the papers together and looked at her directly. "I'll say it plainly," he said. "A museum collection doesn't feed a county, not anymore. What you have here is a labor of love for the right reasons, but the yield data over 3 years is the yield data." He paused. "Your grandfather was a fine farmer. What I'd recommend is transitioning out a quarter of your sorghum acres next season and testing the hybrid program side by side. Give yourself a real comparison." Nora thanked him for his time. He drove away in the white extension pickup, and the drought came in June. It did not come slowly. The rainfall total for June across Barton County was 0.4 inches, against a 30-year average of 3.8. July brought 24 consecutive days where the high temperature cleared 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the last week of July, the mercury hit 112 on a Tuesday that Nora spent mostly in the cellar reading her grandfather's 1988 notes, and then, because there was nothing to do but wait, sitting on the porch with bucket or feet watching the horizon. The color of the county changed in July. It changed the way drought color always changes in Kansas. Not suddenly, but by degrees, the green first dulling to yellow-green, then to straw, then to a brown that deepens as the weeks of dry heat accumulate. By the first week of August, the uniform hybrid sorghum fields across the road and to the south had flagged. Flagging is the term for when a sorghum plant rolls its leaves to reduce transpiration surface. It is the plant conserving water it no longer has in adequate supply. When a field flags, the plant has already given up on setting full grain. It is managing for survival, not for yield. Marcus's fields flagged before Nora's. She could see it from the road. The hybrid sorghum across his fence line was uniform and beautiful in its flagging. Every leaf curled at the same rate, in the same direction, in the same heat, an efficient and heartbreaking uniformity. Her ground, south of the road and lower, was not flagging the same way. Some plants had flagged, many had not. The root systems were already reaching for the subsoil moisture, and the osmotic adjustment chemistry that 56 years of drought selection had built into them was doing quietly, invisibly, exactly what it had been built to do. Marcus did not say anything to Nora about the difference until August. When he called, it was not to compare notes, but because his son had asked him what the difference was between the fields, and he had not been able to answer. "What's in your ground?" he asked. "My grandfather's seed," Nora said. A silence followed that she did not try to fill. The harvest numbers came in October. Barton County's certified hybrid sorghum averaged 31 bushels per acre across the county, down from 84 the previous year, a loss of more than 60% of expected yield on a crop that had looked beautiful in April. Marcus had financed his combine at a payment of $31,000 per year. His combine payment was not smaller because of the drought. He had lost by his own count when he told Nora about it in December, with the flat, specific honesty of a man getting it out of his system, roughly $190,000 in grain value at $7.20 per bushel, on top of a $31,000 combine payment and the center pivot's financing note. Nora's sorghum came in at 58 bushels per acre, not the best she had grown, not close to what she would have made in a normal year, but 58 against a county average of 31 on the same ground, in the same county, in the same drought, and on ridge ground where the neighbors who had watched her plant the old seed and said nothing had averaged 23. The number that mattered most, though, was not 58. Renata Solis arrived in Great Bend in the first week of October and drove out to the Brandt farm on a Thursday morning in a dark green pickup that had seen as many county roads as Nora's. She was 51 years old, originally from Salina, and she had spent the last 18 years as the senior seed buyer for the Plains Heritage Grain Cooperative in Wichita, which sourced open-pollinated and heritage variety grain seed for a market Nora had not known existed in 2019. Chest. Renata came because a county extension. Contact, not Foss, a younger associate who had been watching the Brant yields across the drought season, had mentioned the collection in an email to the cooperative's outreach program. Renata had driven out to look for herself. She brought a germination bench, a moisture meter, and a refractometer. She sat in the cellar for 3 hours with the cedar chest open, going through 12 varieties, running germination rates, and testing for the solute concentrations that indicated drought adaptation potential. She did not say much. She asked the names of varieties, and Nora told her what Otto had called them. Then she came upstairs and sat at the kitchen table with Otto's journal open in front of her, the volume that covered the drought year of 1988, and she read it quietly for a long time. Buck came and lay under the table at Nora's feet. Renata picked up the cloth bag she had set on the table. She read the penciled label. "What did your grandfather call this one?" "He called it Early Red," Nora said. "Brant's Early Red sometimes. He never gave it a formal name." Renata held the bag. She was quiet for a moment longer than felt comfortable. She set it down. "I can offer you $4.40 a pound for certified foundation seed," she said. "That's 2,200 pounds if you can certify the lot." The kitchen was very quiet. $4.40 per pound. In 2019, Dale Foss had told Nora that open-pollinated seed in a hybrid market carried no commercial value. That was not a cruel thing to have said. It was the accurate description of a market in which certified hybrid seed had made most open-pollinated varieties commercially irrelevant. What Foss had not accounted for was a drought year, visible enough to revalue resilience, and a buyer experienced enough to recognize what 56 years of specific selection under Barton County conditions had produced. Nora set her coffee cup on the oilcloth. She looked at the journal. She said yes. Dale Foss came to the farm in November, 2 weeks after Nora had spoken with the cooperative certification specialist. He did not call first. He drove out and knocked on the door and stood on the porch in his navy jacket with his hands in his jacket pockets and said he had heard about the Wichita buyer. Nora let him in and poured coffee. He sat down and looked at the journal on the table, still there from Renata's visit. "How long did he keep records?" he said. 56 years, Nora said. 9 volumes. Foss was quiet for a moment. He picked up volume 7, the 1988 drought volume, and opened it to a random page and read. He read for a few minutes without speaking. "I'd like to submit your drought performance data to the K-State Extension Drought Resilience Program," he said. "If you're willing. The 2022 field data is—" He paused. "It's significant." Nora said she was willing. He looked at the journal again. He said, "I should have asked to see these." That was all he said. It was enough. By the spring of 2023, Nora was supplying certified foundation seed of 3 Otto Brant open-pollinated varieties, Brant's Early Red, a drought-adapted hard red winter wheat she was calling Barton County White, and a mid-season sorghum Otto had simply labeled as the August Keeper, to 6 farms in Barton County ranging in size from 160 to 800 acres. The price the cooperative paid her for foundation seed more than offset the 10 to 12 bushel yield gap in normal years, and the 2022 dataset was in the hands of 3 university extension specialists who had, by February, begun referring to the Brant germplasm in their drought resilience research correspondence. She refused 2 different requests from grain investors to license the seed commercially and scale the operation. She knew from the journal and from her own 3 years of watching the ground What the seed's performance was tied to, specifically the subsoil conditions, the specific rainfall patterns, the clay content at depth in Barton County's particular geology. Moving the seed to a different county and different ground, without the corresponding selection history unto that ground's specific conditions, would start the clock over. The value was not portable. It was not transferable in the way a commercial license assumed. It was specific, and its specificity was the point. She paid off the remaining mortgage on the 320 acres in September of 2023 with grain receipts, the foundation seed payment from the cooperative, and a small grant from the Heritage Grain Research Fund at K-State that Foss had helped her apply for. She did not make a ceremony of it. She walked to the cellar in the evening after the wire transfer cleared and stood in front of the cedar chest with the padlock open in her hand and thought about her grandfather, who had never known he was doing anything more than farming his own ground as carefully as he could. The chest held 47 varieties. It would hold 47 varieties and their successors for as long as someone kept doing the work Otto had done, which was the only way any of it persisted. Marcus Webb put 60 acres of his ground into Nora's early red sorghum in 2023 as a trial on his driest ridge fields. He kept his combine. He kept his hybrid program on the better-watered ground. He was not a converted man in the sense of abandoning everything that had worked for him before. He was a farmer who had seen one number, 31 bushels against 58, and updated accordingly, which is all anyone can honestly be asked to do when a structural fact corrects a structural assumption. Here is what Otto Brandt knew, and what Nora eventually understood, and what Dale Foss came close to understanding when he sat at the kitchen table holding an old man's Drought journal. There are two ways of knowing a piece of ground. The first way is to compare it to other pieces of ground, to measure it against averages, to hold it to certified standards developed across a range of conditions, and expect it to perform accordingly. That kind of knowing is honest and useful, and it is almost always right in ears when conditions are close to average. It is wide and confident, and it has a degree behind it, and it runs on data that is real. The second way is to stay, to plant the same ground for 56 years, to walk the rows in August before the combine comes, and pull seed from the plants that held up when the others didn't. Write down what happened and where and why you think it happened, and to do that again and again and again across decades of heat and dry, and the particular way the subsoil in one county releases its water when the surface is gone. That knowing is narrow and deep, and it does not look like data from the outside. From the outside, it looks like a museum collection. It is not a museum collection. What the first kind of knowing does better is carry across distance. What the second kind does better is carry across drought. Both of those things matter. Most years they do not compete. The years they do compete, the question of which one holds is not settled by a spreadsheet. It is settled by whatever external force arrives to test the underlying assumptions, the heat, the lack of rain, the specific depth of the subsoil moisture in a specific county in a specific dry July. The external force does not care which story sounds more credible in March. Nora was on the porch in the evening in late October of 2023 when Buck came and lay down at her feet, heavier and slower, now his gray muzzle across his forepaws and the cedar chest visible through the open cellar door, catching a slant of afternoon light from the window below. She had a stack of envelopes in her lap, the certified letters from the cooperative seed program confirming the 2023 foundation orders, and she was watching the sorghum fields in the low sun go amber and still. Otto had written in the last entry in Volume 9, dated the 4th of September 2017, 1 week before he died, planted the early red in the east, 40 again. Root system, better than the 2009 selection by a noticeable margin. Keep selecting toward the draw. That was all. He had not written it as a lesson for anyone. He had written it because the observation was true, and it needed to go in the record. What cannot be measured cannot always be improved, but it can sometimes be saved, and saving it, it turns out, is the better kind of wealth.